Today, we're starting a long and fascinating story. The story of how America was discovered, explored, and shaped into the land we know today. It's a story that begins thousands of years before Columbus, before ships crossed the ocean, before the word America even existed. It's a story about people, courage, mistakes, dreams, and discoveries that changed the world forever. Before we begin this journey through time, I want to ask you something simple. Where are you watching us from? Write the name of your country in the comments below. It's always amazing to see how history connects people from every corner of the world. And while you're here, don't forget to subscribe. It helps us a lot and lets us keep bringing you more stories like this one. Many people believe that the history of America begins in 1492, when Christopher Columbus sailed across the Atlantic Ocean. But in truth, the story begins much earlier. Long before Europeans arrived, this land was already home to millions of people. They built villages, cities, and empires. They studied the stars, grew food from the soil, created art, and built strong communities. They were the first Americans, the indigenous peoples of this continent. We will talk about those civilizations that flourished here long before anyone from Europe even knew this land existed. The mighty Mayan cities in the jungles of Central America, the great empire of the Aztecs in Mexico, and the Inca kingdom that stretched across the Andes Mountains of South America. In the north, many Native American nations lived across forests, plains, deserts, and coasts, each with their own cultures and traditions. Then we'll move forward in time to the Age of Exploration, the period in European history when powerful kingdoms were searching for new trade routes and new worlds. It was a time of curiosity, greed, and adventure. Ships set sail into the unknown, carrying men who believed the world was full of mysteries waiting to be found. Among them was a man named Christopher Columbus, whose journey across the Atlantic in 1492 would mark one of the most famous moments in world history. But Columbus was not the first outsider to reach these shores. Centuries before his voyages, explorers from the cold lands of the north, the Vikings, had already touched the coast of North America. Their leader, Leif Erikson, the son of Eric the Red, reached a place they called Vinland, which historians now believe was somewhere in modern-day Canada. Though their time there was short, it showed that the Atlantic had been crossed long before Columbus's name was ever known. In this series, we'll explore what drove these people to risk everything to cross vast oceans. We'll see how the competition between European powers, Spain, Portugal, England, and France, shaped the history of exploration. Each nation wanted to be first, to claim new lands, and to control the riches of the world. But every discovery had a price. Behind the stories of courage and adventure lie stories of loss and tragedy, especially for the indigenous peoples whose lives changed forever after European contact. Their worlds were transformed by disease, war, and colonization, yet their strength and spirit survived through it all. And as explorers began to map these new lands, new families and settlers followed. They came seeking freedom, wealth, and a better life, crossing oceans with nothing but hope and determination. These early settlers would build small colonies, which later grew into powerful communities, the foundations of the future United States and the nations of the Americas we know today. This is the story we're going to tell together. From the first people who called this land home, to the explorers who crossed oceans to find it, and the settlers who built new lives here. It's a story of how the world changed forever. So get comfortable, because we're about to step back in time and discover how it all began.
Long before any European ever dreamed of sailing across the ocean, the lands we now call America were already full of life. Vast forests, endless plains, great rivers, and frozen lands in the north were home to millions of people. These were the first Americans, the ancestors of today's native peoples, who had lived on these lands for thousands of years. No one knows exactly when the first humans arrived, but scientists believe it happened more than 15,000 years ago during the last ice age. Back then, a land bridge connected Asia and North America, where the Bering Strait is today. Groups of hunter-gatherers followed herds of animals across that frozen bridge, not knowing they were stepping into a new world. Slowly, over generations, they spread south, through Alaska, across the Great Plains, and down into Central and South America. They were not one people, but many. Each group adapted to the land around them. In the Arctic, they became skilled hunters, chasing seals and whales across the ice. In the forests, they learned to track deer and gather plants and berries. On the wide plains, they hunted buffalo. In the deserts, they built homes from clay and stone to survive the heat. Every environment created a new way of life, and every group developed its own traditions, languages, and beliefs. Over time, these early societies grew more advanced. They learned to farm, planting maize, beans, and squash, crops that would one day feed millions. Farming allowed people to settle in one place, build villages, and form communities. Soon, some of these communities grew into great civilizations. One of the oldest was the Olmec civilization, often called the mother culture of Mesoamerica. They lived in what is now southern Mexico around 1200 BC. The Olmecs built huge stone heads, some weighing many tons, carved to honor their leaders. They developed early writing and a calendar, and their ideas influenced all the great civilizations that came after them. From the Olmecs came the rise of the Mayan people. The Mayan people built incredible cities deep in the jungles of Central America. They studied the stars, created complex calendars, and wrote books on folded bark paper. Their pyramids rose high above the trees, and their temples were decorated with carvings that told the stories of gods and kings. Farther north, in the highlands of Mexico, came the Aztecs, a powerful people who built the grand city of Tenochtitlan on an island in the middle of a lake. It was one of the largest cities in the world at the time, full of temples, markets, and canals. The Aztecs were fierce warriors, but also skilled builders and artists. Their empire stretched across much of Mexico until the arrival of the Spanish in the 1500s. In the south, across the towering Andes Mountains, rose the Inca Empire. The Incas built a vast network of roads and bridges that connected their lands, from the coast of Peru to the mountains of Chile. They farmed on terraces carved into steep hillsides and built stone cities like Cusco and Machu Picchu, which still stand today as proof of their genius. But not all great cultures were in the south. Across North America, hundreds of tribes lived in harmony with the land. The Mississippian people built massive earth mounds like those at Cahokia near modern-day St. Louis. In the southwest, the ancestral Pueblanos, sometimes called the Anasazi, built homes inside cliffs high above the desert floor. In the forests of the northeast, the Iroquois formed powerful confederations and developed systems of government that would later inspire parts of modern democracy. Everywhere you looked across these vast lands, human creativity was alive. They traded goods across long distances, shared ideas, and passed down stories through generations. The Americas were not an empty wilderness waiting to be discovered. They were already home to rich and thriving civilizations. As centuries passed, these societies changed and adapted to their surroundings. They faced droughts, wars, migrations, and rebirths. Some cities were abandoned and swallowed by the jungle. Others grew stronger and more complex. By the time European explorers began crossing the Atlantic,
The Americas were home to more than 50 million people, living in thousands of nations, each with its own history. Their world was full of meaning, connection, and tradition. They watched the stars to understand the seasons, honored nature as a living force, and built homes, temples, and roads that shaped the land. When the first European ships appeared on the horizon, it was not a meeting of discovery, it was a meeting of two very old worlds.
Hundreds of years before Christopher Columbus was even born, another group of explorers had already crossed the Atlantic Ocean. They were the Vikings, fierce sailors and warriors from Scandinavia, the lands we now call Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. The Vikings were not only fighters, they were also skilled shipbuilders and travelers who explored far beyond their homeland. Their story in the Americas begins around the year 1000 AD, nearly 5 centuries before Columbus's famous voyage. One of their greatest explorers was a man named Leif Erikson. He was the son of Eric the Red, a bold and stubborn leader who had founded a settlement on the icy island of Greenland after being exiled from Norway. Leif grew up hearing stories of adventure, danger, and discovery. He learned to sail in the harsh northern seas, where waves were high and the weather could change in moments. Vikings used strong wooden ships called longships, which could travel across oceans and glide through shallow rivers. These ships allowed them to explore places no one else dared to go. According to ancient sagas, the stories passed down by Viking storytellers, Leif Erikson heard about a mysterious land to the west of Greenland. Some sailors claimed they had seen it by accident, blown off course during a storm. It was said to be a place with green forests, wild grapes, and fresh water, a sharp contrast to the cold, rocky lands of the north. Driven by curiosity and courage, Leif gathered a small crew and set sail westward. After days at sea, the Vikings sighted land. They explored 3 regions, naming them Helluland, Markland, and Vinland. Helluland, meaning land of flat stones, is believed to be modern-day Baffin Island in Canada. Markland, meaning land of forests, may have been Labrador. And Vinland, meaning land of wine or land of meadows, is thought to have been somewhere along the coast of Newfoundland. The Vikings built small shelters and explored the area, amazed by its natural beauty. They found wild grapes, salmon, and fertile soil, things that were rare in their homeland. For a short time, they lived peacefully, hunting and exploring this new world. But they were not alone. They soon encountered the native peoples of North America, whom they called Skraelings. At first, there was curiosity between the two groups. The Vikings traded goods with the locals, red cloth, metal tools, and other items unknown to the native peoples. But the peace did not last long. Misunderstandings and fear led to conflict. The Vikings were skilled fighters, but they were far from home and outnumbered. After several clashes, they decided to leave Vinland and sail back to Greenland. Although the Viking settlements in North America did not last, their journey proved something incredible, that the Atlantic Ocean could be crossed long before Columbus. Their stories of Vinland were passed down for centuries in the Norse sagas. At first, many people thought these tales were only legends. But in the 1960s, archaeologists discovered the remains of a Norse settlement at Land's O Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada. The ruins matched the old sagas, confirming that the Vikings truly had reached America around the year 1000. This discovery changed what historians knew about the past. It showed that European contact with the Americas happened long before the age of Columbus, though it did not lead to lasting colonies or wide knowledge across Europe. The Vikings' adventures remained local stories in the north, forgotten by most of the world. Still, their spirit of exploration lived on. The Vikings were part of a larger human desire, the need to discover what lies beyond the horizon. They did not come searching for gold or empires. They came out of curiosity, courage, and a love of adventure. As centuries passed, Europe began to change. The age of the Vikings came to an end, but their legacy inspired the explorers who came after them. By the 1400s, the great kingdoms of Europe, Spain, Portugal, England, and France, were looking outward again. They wanted new trade routes, new lands, and new power, and it was in this time that a sailor named Christopher Columbus dreamed of sailing west, a dream that would lead to one of the greatest turning points in human history.
By the late 1400s, Europe was changing in ways that would shape the world forever. Nations were growing stronger, trade was expanding, and people were curious about lands beyond the horizon. The kings and queens of Spain, Portugal, and other countries wanted to find new trade routes to Asia, hoping to bring back spices, silk, and other treasures that were rare and valuable. Christopher Columbus was a sailor with a bold idea. He believed that by sailing west across the Atlantic Ocean, he could reach Asia more quickly than by the long route around Africa. Many people at the time thought his plan was impossible. They believed the ocean was too vast, that ships could not survive such a long journey, or that the world was flat. But Columbus was determined. He believed in his vision, even when others doubted him. Columbus was born in 1451 in Genoa, Italy, a city famous for trade and sailing. From a young age, he learned to navigate the seas, study maps, and understand the stars. He spent years working as a sailor and a navigator, traveling across the Mediterranean and along the coasts of Africa. Each voyage taught him more about the world and strengthened his desire to explore unknown lands. Eventually, Columbus brought his plan to the Spanish monarchs, King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. After much debate, they agreed to sponsor his expedition. They gave him 3 ships, the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, and a small crew of men who were eager for adventure, riches, or a new life. On August 3, 1492, Columbus set sail from Spain, leaving behind the familiar shores of Europe. The journey was long and difficult. The sailors faced storms, uncertainty, and fear. Weeks passed, and some of the men began to doubt whether they would ever find land. Columbus, however, kept their spirits alive, reminding them that a great discovery awaited beyond the horizon. Finally, on October 12, 1492, after more than 2 months at sea, land was sighted. Columbus and his crew had reached an island in the Caribbean. Columbus believed he had reached islands near Asia, unaware that he had stumbled upon a completely new continent. He named the first island he landed on San Salvador and claimed it for Spain. Over the next few months, Columbus explored several islands in the Caribbean, including modern-day Cuba and Hispaniola. He met the native peoples, whom he called Indians, believing he had reached the shores of Asia. He observed their way of life, their villages, and their skills, and he was both amazed and intrigued by their world. Columbus returned to Spain in 1493 as a hero. His voyage proved that it was possible to cross the Atlantic Ocean, and it opened the door for future exploration. His journey marked the beginning of the Age of Exploration, a time when European nations sent ships across the oceans to claim lands, trade goods, and expand their power. Yet Columbus's arrival also marked the start of great change and tragedy for the native peoples of the Americas.
Diseases brought by Europeans, conflicts, and colonization would forever alter the lives of the millions of people who had lived on these lands for thousands of years. The world that Columbus encountered was vibrant and alive, but it was also about to face profound disruption. His voyages would inspire others to explore. Soon, Spanish, Portuguese, English, and French explorers followed him to the New World, each seeking wealth, land, or new opportunities. Towns and settlements began to appear, and the first European colonies were established. The story of discovery was now becoming a story of colonization, growth, and the meeting of two very different worlds. After Columbus's voyages, many Europeans became determined to explore and settle in the Americas. The Spanish were the first to establish lasting colonies, beginning in the Caribbean and later spreading to Central and South America. They built towns, forts, and missions, seeking gold, silver, and other treasures that were rare and valuable. Meanwhile, the English and French also looked to the New World as a place to start new lives. In 1607, English settlers established Jamestown in what is now Virginia. It was the first permanent English colony in North America. Life in Jamestown was difficult. The settlers faced hunger, disease, and harsh winters. Many were not prepared for the challenges of the land, and only a small number survived the first few years. Among these early settlers were families who hoped to build a better future. Men, women, and children crossed the ocean, leaving behind everything familiar. They built homes from wood and clay, planted crops, and hunted for food. Their lives were hard, but they were determined to make the land their own. These first families had to rely on each other and learn quickly from the land and from the indigenous peoples who guided them and traded with them. In New England, settlers from England arrived in the early 1600s seeking religious freedom. The Pilgrims landed at Plymouth in 1620. They faced freezing winters, scarce food, and disease. But with the help of the local Wampanoag people, who taught them how to plant corn and fish in the rivers, the settlers survived. This cooperation led to the famous First Thanksgiving, a moment when two very different peoples shared food and gave thanks for survival. Life in the colonies was a mix of hope and struggle. Children grew up learning to farm, fish, and trade. Women managed homes, gardens, and even sometimes businesses. Communities were small, and everyone's work was important. Though life was difficult, families stayed together, teaching each other skills and traditions that would last for generations. The settlers also began to build towns and churches, creating the first European-style communities in the Americas. Roads, markets, and public buildings slowly took shape. Over time, these settlements grew, attracting more families and creating the foundation for larger towns and eventually cities. But the arrival of Europeans brought major changes for the native populations. Land that had been used for hunting, farming, and living for centuries was now being cleared for European crops and settlements. Conflicts arose, and the native peoples faced diseases brought by Europeans that spread quickly and caused devastating losses. Despite these challenges, many indigenous communities adapted, resisted, and found ways to survive alongside the new settlers. By the mid-1600s, the Americas had become a patchwork of colonies, with settlers from different nations building homes, farms, and towns. These first families played a crucial role in establishing the European presence in the New World. They endured hardships, learned from the land, and passed on their skills and traditions to future generations. Through their experiences, we can see how the Americas transformed from a land of native civilizations into a land where European settlements began to take root, setting the stage for the centuries of history that followed.
In the North, the English had founded colonies like Jamestown in Virginia, and Plymouth in Massachusetts. Jamestown, established in 1607, was the first permanent English settlement in North America. Life there was brutal. Many of the settlers were not prepared for the harsh winters, diseases, or lack of food. Yet, through determination and help from the local Powhatan people, they managed to survive. Over time, they learned how to grow tobacco, a crop that would soon become as valuable as gold. Further north, in 1620, another group of English settlers arrived, the Pilgrims. They came aboard a small ship called the Mayflower, seeking religious freedom. When they landed on the rocky shores of what is now Massachusetts, they faced a cruel winter that claimed many lives. But those who survived built a new community, one based on faith, hard work, and unity. They called it Plymouth Colony, and it became a symbol of hope for future settlers. Meanwhile, in the South, the Spanish were expanding their reach. They built missions and forts across places that are now Florida, Mexico, and the American Southwest. These settlements were often religious outposts where missionaries tried to convert indigenous people to Christianity. The Spanish influence would shape much of the culture and architecture of these regions for centuries to come. To the north and east, the French were busy exploring the interior of the continent. They traveled along the St. Lawrence River and the Great Lakes, establishing trade with Native American tribes. Their settlements, like Quebec and Montreal, became centers of fur trading and cultural exchange. Unlike many others, the French often worked alongside indigenous nations, forming alliances and friendships that lasted for generations. The Dutch, too, left their mark. They founded New Amsterdam on the island of Manhattan, a busy trading post that would one day become New York City. Their colony attracted people from many nations, making it one of the most diverse places in the New World, even in the 1600s. Across the continent, life was a blend of struggle and opportunity. Settlers built homes from timber, tilled the soil for crops, and hunted for food. Every day was a test of endurance. Yet, through hunger, sickness, and conflict, they held on to their belief that they could build a better life in this new world. As the decades passed, the small colonies that dotted the American coast began to grow and change. Towns expanded, ports became busier, and the population rose steadily as more ships arrived from Europe. Some settlers came for religious freedom, others for adventure, and many simply to escape poverty and find new opportunities. But every new arrival helped shape the identity of what would one day become a nation. In the English colonies, society began to divide into regions, each with its own character. In New England, life revolved around tight-knit communities and small farms. The people there valued hard work, education, and faith. Many towns built schools and churches, seeing knowledge and belief as the foundation of a strong society. Further south, the colonies of Virginia, Maryland, and the Carolinas developed differently. The land was rich and fertile, perfect for growing crops like tobacco, rice, and later cotton. Large plantations spread across the countryside, worked by enslaved Africans brought against their will through the transatlantic slave trade. This dark chapter would cast a long shadow over America's future. In the middle colonies, such as New York, New Jersey, and Pennsylvania, diversity thrived. People from England, the Netherlands, Germany, and Sweden lived side by side. These colonies became centers of trade, where merchants, farmers, and artisans all contributed to a growing economy. In Pennsylvania, founded by William Penn, religious tolerance was a cornerstone. It became a haven for people seeking freedom of belief. But life in the New World wasn't peaceful for everyone. As settlers expanded, they pushed into lands already inhabited by Native American tribes. This led to tensions, misunderstandings, and often tragic conflict. Native peoples fought to protect their homelands, while colonists saw the land as open for the taking. The balance of power shifted slowly but surely,
as disease, displacement, and warfare weakened indigenous nations across the continent. Still, not every encounter was marked by conflict. In many areas, trade and cooperation flourished. Furs, tools, and crops were exchanged, and some settlers learned valuable survival skills from their native neighbors. The story of early America was one of both cooperation and collision, two worlds trying to share the same land, often with very different hopes and visions. By the early 1700s, the colonies were firmly established. The children and grandchildren of the first settlers now saw America as their true home. They were no longer just Europeans living abroad. They were Americans, with their own customs, accents, and ideas. Yet they were still tied to the powers of Europe, especially England, which ruled the colonies and taxed their trade.
By the mid-1700s, the American colonies had grown stronger, richer, and more confident. Towns and cities were bustling with trade, farms stretched across the countryside, and people were building communities that reflected their values and dreams. Yet, despite this growth, the colonies were still under the control of England. British laws and taxes, often passed without the consent of the colonists, began to cause frustration and resentment. Small acts of protest slowly grew into larger movements. People argued that they should have a say in the laws that affected their daily lives. The famous phrase, "no taxation without representation," captured the growing sentiment. The colonists wanted a voice in how they were governed. Tensions simmered as Britain continued to enforce taxes on tea, paper, and other everyday goods. Conflicts arose between the colonists and British soldiers, sometimes erupting into violence. One of the most famous early events was the Boston Tea Party in 1773, when colonists, dressed as Native Americans, boarded ships and threw crates of tea into the harbor to protest taxes. These acts of defiance showed that the desire for independence was growing stronger with each passing year. Leaders emerged in the colonies, men and women who were determined to fight for freedom. Figures like George Washington, Benjamin Franklin, Thomas Jefferson, and John Adams began to organize resistance, writing pamphlets, forming committees, and uniting the colonies in a shared cause. The stage was set for a dramatic struggle that would decide the future of the continent. In 1775, tensions boiled over into war. The first shots were fired at Lexington and Concord in Massachusetts, marking the beginning of the American Revolutionary War. Ordinary citizens, farmers, and townspeople became soldiers fighting for a new vision, a nation where people could govern themselves and pursue liberty. The struggle was long and difficult, with victories and defeats on both sides. Allies were crucial. France, seeing an opportunity to weaken Britain, joined the conflict and provided crucial support in troops, ships, and supplies. The help of these allies, combined with the determination of the American fighters, turned the tide of the war. After 8 years of fighting, the colonies finally won their independence with the signing of the Treaty of Paris in 1783. The creation of a new nation brought both hope and challenges. The United States of America was born, but now the leaders had the task of creating a government, writing a constitution, and uniting a diverse population under one banner. The first families who had arrived generations earlier and their descendants now lived in a country they had helped to shape, a land transformed from the struggles, dreams, and courage of all who had settled here. After gaining independence, the United States faced the enormous task of building a nation from scratch. The first challenge was creating a government that balanced power, protected rights, and united people who had once been separate colonies. Leaders like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, and James Madison worked to draft a constitution, a document that would become the foundation of American law and democracy. With the Constitution ratified in 1789, the country began to grow. The first presidents, senators, and judges were sworn in, and the new government worked to establish stability.
Yet life for ordinary families was still challenging. Most Americans lived on farms where daily life depended on hard work from sunrise to sunset. Families planted crops, raised livestock, and built homes from the land around them. Children learned skills from their parents, helping maintain farms and communities, and passing knowledge from one generation to the next. As the population grew, settlers looked westward. The vast lands beyond the Appalachian Mountains promised fertile soil, forests, and opportunities for a new start. Families packed their belongings into wagons, crossed rivers, and traveled along rough trails. Life on the frontier was difficult. Settlers faced harsh weather, wild animals, and sometimes conflict with Native American tribes defending their homelands. But for many, the chance to own land and build a life outweighed the dangers. The Louisiana Purchase in 1803 doubled the size of the United States, opening vast territories for settlement. New states were carved from these lands, and towns and villages sprang up along rivers and streams. Families worked together to clear fields, build homes, and establish schools and churches. Communities grew slowly at first, but over decades, the network of towns, farms, and trade routes expanded across the continent. Life was not the same everywhere. In the southern states, large plantations relied heavily on enslaved Africans whose labor fueled the economy. In the north, industry and trade began to develop, with small towns becoming centers for crafts, markets, and manufacturing. Despite these differences, the idea of creating a new nation bound the people together even as challenges arose. Travel, communication, and trade gradually connected distant settlements. Roads were built, rivers were used for transport, and eventually railroads linked towns across long distances. Families moved, communities grew, and the country became more diverse as immigrants from Europe arrived seeking freedom, opportunity, and a new life. The first families that had come centuries earlier, and their descendants, now lived in a country they had helped to shape. A land transformed from the struggles, dreams, and courage of all who had settled here.
As the United States grew, many families looked beyond the rivers and mountains of the East for new opportunities. The idea of manifest destiny, the belief that Americans were meant to expand across the continent, inspired thousands to move westward. Pioneers packed their belongings into wagons and traveled on long, dusty trails, seeking fertile land, adventure, and a better future for their children. Life on the frontier was difficult and often dangerous. Families faced wild animals, harsh weather, and illnesses with little help nearby. Children learned to help from an early age, gathering firewood, tending animals, and assisting with planting crops. Fathers built homes, barns, and fences, while mothers prepared food, cared for children, and maintained the household. Every day required teamwork, courage, and endurance. Despite these hardships, settlers built communities wherever they went. Small towns grew around rivers, crossroads, and trading posts. Schools were established so children could learn to read, write, and count. Churches were built not just for worship, but as community centers where families gathered to celebrate, mourn, and support one another. Markets and stores opened, connecting remote towns to the growing economy of the nation. The railroad played a huge role in connecting the frontier with the East. By the mid-1800s, railroads allowed people, goods, and ideas to travel faster than ever before. Families could send crops to distant markets, receive supplies, and communicate with relatives in other states. Railroads transformed the frontier from a distant wilderness into a land that felt more connected and accessible. As settlers moved west, they often encountered Native American nations who had lived on the land for centuries. Some groups traded and cooperated with the newcomers, sharing knowledge about crops, hunting, and survival. Unfortunately, many others were forced off their lands through government policies and conflict. These encounters were sometimes violent, leaving a lasting mark on the history of the frontier. Immigrant families played an important role in building the western towns.
Germans, Irish, Italians, and many others brought their skills, traditions, and customs. They built churches, schools, and businesses, contributing to the diversity and culture of the growing nation. Each family's work, from farming to shopkeeping, helped turn wilderness into thriving communities. By the late 1800s, towns had become cities, and the frontier had moved farther west. Families who had started with little more than a wagon and hope now had homes, schools, farms, and businesses. Their determination, resilience, and vision shaped the land and created the foundation for modern America. By the mid-1800s, the United States was no longer just a nation of farms and frontier settlements. Factories, railroads, and cities were growing, transforming the way people lived and worked. Families who once relied only on the land now found themselves adapting to life in towns and cities, where new jobs, technologies, and ways of life awaited. Children often left farms to work in factories, learning trades and contributing to the household income. Men worked long hours in mills, railroads, and construction, while women balanced work with caring for their homes and children. Life was challenging, but the promise of progress and opportunity kept families moving forward. Immigrants continued to arrive in large numbers. Germans, Irish, Italians, and later people from Eastern Europe brought new languages, foods, and traditions. They settled in growing cities like New York, Boston, Chicago, and Philadelphia, forming vibrant neighborhoods. Their work helped build factories, railroads, bridges, and the infrastructure that would support America's growth. Railroads connected the nation like never before, shrinking the distance between the coasts. Farmers could send crops to faraway cities, goods could travel faster, and families could move more easily to new opportunities. The telegraph, and later the telephone, improved communication, allowing people to stay in touch with relatives across great distances. Yet this growth also brought challenges. Cities became crowded, and living conditions were often poor. Disease spread quickly, and the gap between rich and poor grew. Families had to adapt, finding ways to survive and support one another in the midst of rapid change. Many relied on extended family networks, neighbors, and community organizations for help. Meanwhile, the question of slavery continued to divide the nation. Enslaved Africans were forced to work on plantations in the South, enduring unimaginable hardship. Families were torn apart, and communities lived under constant oppression. The struggle over slavery would eventually lead to the Civil War, a conflict that would reshape the nation and test the strength and courage of countless families. Despite these hardships, families continued to work, hope, and dream. They built homes, schools, churches, and businesses. They celebrated traditions, passed down stories, and prepared the next generation to inherit the rapidly changing nation. Through their resilience, determination, and creativity, they helped America grow from a frontier nation into an industrial power. By the mid-1800s, the United States was a nation divided. The economy, culture, and way of life in the North were very different from those in the South. In the North, industry, trade, and small farms dominated. In the South, large plantations relied heavily on the labor of enslaved Africans. These differences, combined with moral and political debates over slavery, led to growing tension between the regions. Families were deeply affected by these divisions. In the South, enslaved families lived under constant fear of separation, working long hours on plantations and struggling to hold their communities together. Free families in both North and South were also touched by the debates, often facing difficult decisions about their loyalties, beliefs, and futures. The tension reached a breaking point in 1861 when 11 Southern states seceded from the Union, forming the Confederate States of America. War erupted,
and what followed was the bloodiest conflict in American history, the Civil War. Battles raged across towns, fields, and rivers, leaving devastation in their wake. Fathers, sons, and brothers fought on both sides, while mothers, daughters, and wives cared for the wounded and tried to maintain some semblance of daily life. The war was not only fought on battlefields. Families at home faced hunger, disease, and the uncertainty of whether their loved ones would return. Children often had to take on adult responsibilities, helping on farms or working in towns to support their households. Communities were torn apart, and the lives of ordinary people were forever changed by the violence and loss. In 1863, President Abraham Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all enslaved people in the Confederate States were free. This was a turning point, giving hope to millions and signaling a future in which the United States would no longer allow slavery to exist. By 1865, the Union had won the war, but the country faced the enormous task of rebuilding and healing. The Reconstruction era that followed was a time of both hope and struggle. Formerly enslaved people began to build new lives, forming communities, churches, and schools. Families who had been separated worked to reunite, while others sought opportunities in farming, trade, and skilled work. Many challenges remained, including resistance from groups opposed to equality, economic hardship, and political conflict. Despite the difficulties, Reconstruction laid the foundation for a more inclusive nation. Families who had survived slavery, war, and displacement worked tirelessly to pass down their culture, traditions, and values to future generations. Across the United States, communities slowly rebuilt, towns recovered, and new opportunities emerged as the country looked toward the future. After the Civil War and Reconstruction, the United States entered a period of rapid change. Factories, railroads, and cities grew at an unprecedented pace. Families who had once lived on farms moved to towns and cities to work in factories, shops, and offices. The promise of steady jobs and new opportunities drew millions of people from both within the country and from overseas. Immigration played a major role in shaping this era. People arrived from Ireland, Germany, Italy, Eastern Europe, and later Asia, seeking freedom, work, and a new start. Many settled in bustling cities like New York, Chicago, and San Francisco, where neighborhoods were often organized by nationality. Families relied on each other for support, sharing traditions, languages, and skills that helped them adapt to life in America. Industrialization created both opportunity and hardship. Factories offered jobs, but the work was long, dangerous, and poorly paid. Children often worked alongside their parents, helping to support the household. Families lived in crowded tenements where sanitation was poor and disease spread quickly. Yet they persevered, creating strong communities, mutual aid societies, and cultural organizations to support one another. Meanwhile, technology and infrastructure transformed daily life. Railroads connected cities and towns across vast distances, making it easier to move goods and people. Telegraphs and telephones allowed families to communicate with loved ones far away. Electricity, running water, and public transportation slowly improved living conditions in urban areas. Education became more widespread during this period. Schools were established in towns and cities, giving children new opportunities to learn reading, writing, math, and practical skills.
Families placed great value in education as a way for the next generation to achieve a better life. At the same time, the country expanded westward. Homesteaders continued to settle the plains, building farms and small towns. Railroads carried settlers, goods and mail, linking the East with the developing West. Families on the frontier faced challenges similar to those of earlier pioneers: harsh weather, isolation, and conflict with native peoples, but they also carried with them hopes for opportunity and a new start. By the early 1900s, America had become a nation of cities, towns, farms, and industries. Families adapted to change, worked together, and passed down traditions while embracing new technologies, jobs, and ways of life. The story of these families shows the resilience and determination that shaped the country and prepared it for the challenges of the 20th century.